Skeletal tissue itself is made out of connective tissues, which is cartilage, or different types of cartilage, and then osseous tissue, which is bones. We'll see those being divided into two categories. One will be compact, one will be spongy. Anybody here see SpongeBob? Yeah. Spongy bone is sort of made like that. It's very loose, and there's space in between, like anything that crawls inside of SpongeBob and goes into his brain. Spongy bone is like that. It's actually got space in between the actual cells. Compact bone is a little bit more like a strong, sturdy wall, or like a steel door. Everything is nice and tight. There's not space in between the cells. At least not much space. There's these little tunnels, and we'll talk about those. So it's very nice and tight. Now, cartilage itself is typically avascular. If something's avascular, what does that mean?
No blood.
There's no blood supply. And that's one of the reasons when cartilage becomes damaged, it can become such a long-term problem, because it doesn't have a very good heal rate. So it takes a long time for cartilage to heal if it does at all. And there's three major types that we need to know about. The first one is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is what makes up our articular cartilage. Where do we find articular cartilage? You remember from last week?
Joints?
Joints, specifically on what part of the bone? What was that? At the articular process? Yeah, absolutely. So like the superior articular process of the facet joint. What about with the long bone? Where will we find that articular cartilage? At the epiphysis, right? At the distal or proximal epiphysis, we'll find it covered with this articular cartilage. So articular cartilage will be found in joints. That's true. We do find them at the superior articular process. That's true. And we'll also find that they typically cover the ends of bones where they're going to articulate with another bone, which typically is in some sort of a joint. We're also going to see something called the epiphyseal growth plate. The name implies that there's growth that's happening in the bone there. That's typically what we're really nervous about. If someone's 5, 7, 8 years old and they're doing maybe gymnastics and they fall and they break their arm, we're typically concerned that they may have damaged the epiphyseal growth plate, which means that that limb would no longer grow. The other side will continue to grow, but damage to that epiphyseal growth plate could delay or completely stop the growth process. And so if someone were to fracture one leg, but the other leg was fine, they may end up having a very long leg here and a very short leg on the other side. So again, it's one of the concerns, and that's one of the things that typically is getting ruled out when people fracture the bones around those areas. Now, these epiphyseal growth plates will close as we stop growing in height. Bone never stops growing, though. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Bone will never stop growing. Okay, there's a constant process of bone being broken down and then bone being built back up. But what stops is this growing in length. Okay, so the length of bones will stop, but bone itself doesn't stop growing. Fibrocartilage is another type of our cartilage. We have large amounts of collagen in those areas. We don't typically find any of this in bones. We typically find these in the joints themselves. So we'll see things like the symphysis or the intervertebral disc that we see in between the vertebrae are like that. This forms the annulus fibrosus of the intervertebral disc, which is the outer portion of the disc that separates each one of our vertebral bones. We also find it in the symphysis, which is typically what we think of as the pubic symphysis. There's a couple other ones as well too. And then elastic cartilage, as the name implies, has lots of elastin, which means that the bone itself is a little more flexible. We find that in small quantities in the skeleton because we want the skeleton to be somewhat flexible, but not too flexible, because it's got to be really strong, but at the same time, it's got to have some flexibility to it as well too. Now, osseous tissue contains a pretty complicated intracellular matrix. It's made up of about 5 to 10% water. You guys had any water this morning? I had my water in my coffee, okay, which is not good, right? Because coffee is what? It's a diuretic, yeah, and so it actually causes you to get dehydrated. But I believe that if you drink coffee for 20 or 30 years, your body adapts. So it's been about 30 or 40 years for me now, so I'm saying my body's adapted to it. Yeah, that's a great question. So we're going to find out that our intervertebral disc is a little bit like a jelly donut. Inside the jelly is what we call the nucleus pulsus, and it's really kind of like a mucus-like tissue that's inside, but I prefer a jelly donut. It sounds a little more tempting. The outer portion of the donut itself is the annulus fibrosus. So typically what happens is degradation to the annulus fibrosus over time, and layers of that annulus fibrosis as they begin to tear allow some of the nucleus pulses to herniate out of that sort of barrier. It's almost like you take a bite at the wrong end of the donut and the jelly shoots out. Okay, so that little hole is where some of the nucleus pulses will begin to go out, and it causes inflammation and irritation because there's tissue where it shouldn't be, and your immune system will actually cause an inflammatory response to try to take care of that. So it's kind of a complex of the two. You have to have some damage of the annulus fibrosis in order for some of that nucleus pulses to actually go out. A portion of that, though, can also be the loss of fluid. So a lot of that intervertebral disc is actually water-like structures, and so as we get dehydrated or as fluid starts going out that doesn't come back in to the disc, that can lead to degradation as well too. So about 5 to 10% of the bone itself is water. 30 to 35%, this is the organic portion. These are our collagen fibers, and then we have lots of minerals, right? The big mineral that we think about is calcium. There's also phosphorus in there as well too. So when calcium is released, phosphorus levels also go up inside the body as well. We can use those as cancer markers for stuff that are osteolytic. If something's osteolytic, what does that mean it's doing? It's breaking down the bone, because lysis, right, that means to break something down. It means pertaining to, osteo means bone, so osteolytic lesions are lesions that are breaking down bone. If you break down bone, you're going to release the calcium. You're also going to release phosphorus in the blood as well too. So some blood levels that are checked when we suspect someone having cancer could be the phosphorus levels, and we'll see those go up in different types of osteolytic cancers, osteolytic mets, and things like that, metastatic disease. There's other minerals in there as well too, though. There's magnesium, fluoride, and sulfate. The calcification process, our mineral salts are going to make the collagen. That fiber is going to harden and then crystallize. And last week, did we say what kind of cells build bone? Osteoblasts. So the osteoblasts are what help build bone. Okay. We're going to find lots of these dispersed in bone cells. There's two different types of it though. There's cortical or compact. Those names mean the exact same thing. So those are just AKAs. So cortical bone or compact bone, those are exactly the same thing. Cancellous bone or spongy bone, those are the same thing. Okay? You can see either one of those words on a test and they just mean the same thing. Now, when we consider the properties of bone tissue, we want to consider its hardness, which is the inorganic portion, and then the flexibility, which is the organic portion. Because remember, the flexibility of bone is what allows it to have a little bit of flex to it without actually breaking itself. So our bones, we don't typically think about it, but things like our vertebrae actually bend a little bit. They actually squish a little bit sometimes when they're under significant load. Sometimes that'll cause the disc material to actually herniate inside of the bone. But then as the pressure is taken off, it sort of works like a vacuum and it sucks it back out where it's supposed to be. So there's a little bit of give and take in flexibility of the bone flesh. If that system breaks down, though, we end up with a fracture in the end plate of the vertebra, and you could actually end up with something called a Schmorl's node, which looks a little bit like somebody took a pencil eraser and just kind of stuck it into the top of, or the bottom of a bone. Okay? Normally, if something fractures in bone, especially the vertebra, it's those vertebral end plates, meaning the top or the bottom of the vertebra is typically the most common system or the most common part of the bone that fractures or fails. Here we can see an osteoclast. Osteoclasts do what to bone?
Break it down.
They break bone down, okay? Break it down. I swore music was getting ready to start, and people were going to start dancing. I heard break it down. My little girl, she's like 19 months old. She loves to dance. She just runs around the house going, APT, APT. What's the girl's name that sings it with her? I don't know if you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, she goes crazy dancing all over the hospital. So, anyway, osteoclasts are big and fat. They break down bones. They're catabolic. They destroy bone. We can see that they're multinucleated. There's lots of nuclei that are inside of there, so it's a fusion of lots of monocytes. Osteoblasts, I think of these as like the bodybuilders or the people in the gym who are really trying to get fit. So they're much smaller, sleeker, stronger, right? They're building stuff up. And then this is that fibrocartilaginous matrix where we see things all kind of held together. Osteoprogenitor cells are what they sound like. They're osteogenic cells. Genesis means beginning. This means pertaining to. Osteo means bone, right? So osteogenic cells are cells that are involved with essentially initiating the process of forming bone cells. We find these in the periosteum, the endosteum, and the vascular canals where blood vessels are passing through bone. The periosteum is the white covering of bone. It's what's on the outside of bone, right? So on the outside of bone, we said it's covered with that thick layer of periosteum. We said there's 2 layers. And we said on the inside, that's where we find those osteoblastic cells because bones are building up. But on that outer layer, we don't find those osteoblastic cells because we don't want bone growing outside of bone. Does that make sense? So again, just a reminder from last week. The endosteum, where did we say we would find that? It's sort of like the walls inside. So like if we were in the middle of a long bone, and we were to reach out to the side, the walls that are surrounding us, the wallpaper is the endosteum. So it's what's covering or lining the inside of that medullary cavity where we find our yellow marrow and our red marrow. Now, this comes from what we call mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is a form of embryonic connective tissue that differentiates and becomes the bone cells themselves. If something's mitotically active, what does that mean?
It goes under and undergoes mitosis.
Yeah, so it's replicating, right? So it's able to actively replicate, so it's mitotically active, cells divide, and these will ultimately differentiate into the osteoblasts themselves. So the osteogenic cells that we find in the periosteum, endosteum, and vascular canals initially are unspecialized, meaning that they haven't chosen essentially their career path yet. They are derived from this tissue and eventually will become osteoblasts. Now, osteoblasts have 2 basic jobs. They synthesize and secrete the collagen, and they also initiate the calcification process. Osteoblasts are a little confusing. They do a really good job of building the bone, but then they sort of trap themselves inside of that bone that they create. So it's almost like digging a really big tunnel, but you didn't dig a way out. And so now you're stuck inside the tunnel, and you're just there until you get old. The osteoblasts, after they build themselves into that tunnel, become osteocytes. So osteocytes originate from osteoblasts that are no longer mitotically active and essentially in their old age phase. Okay? So the osteoblasts build that bone, become trapped inside their own matrix, and then they differentiate into these osteocytes which no longer undergo mitosis. Okay? So they're no longer mitotically active. Now that makes sense because in the middle of bone, you don't want new bone growing. You want it really growing on the outside and in that medullary cavity. That's where you see the osteoclastic activity and then the osteoblast kind of rebuilding it. Yes, sir?
Will you usually see a presence of osteoblasts during like a bone break, or are they always kind of rebuilding bone?
So I would say both. So there's always sort of a turnover of bone. When we're waking up, we're walking against gravity, when we're picking things up, there's micro damage that's happening to our osseous tissue. It's a living dynamic system that responds to stress just like every other system in our body. And so there's a certain amount of turnover that happens. There's also a need sometimes for things like calcium in our blood, so our body will break down that bone and release that calcium. And then the osteoclasts release it, and the osteoblast will go back when we have plenty of calcium and start rebuilding that area of that bone.
So, sorry, people who have a very, partake in a very sedentary lifestyle, will we see a lower count of osteoblast production?
I don't know that you'll see a lower overall number of cells. I think maybe it might make sense if there'd be like a smaller difference in them. They still have the potential. So if someone has a sedentary lifestyle and they're not being very active, they can still, let's say someone's sedentary, but let's say they weigh 440 pounds.
Sure.
For that person to get up and to go to the kitchen or go to the bathroom or to their car, that's actually a tremendous load. And believe it or not, that weight will actually cause the bone to respond, and it'll actually be super healthy. So even though they themselves overall are not very healthy, their skeletal system is very strong. But you could take someone who's very, very active, maybe to a fault, and let's say they're 90 pounds, and they're exercising 6-7 days a week, and now their skeletal system is actually more frail than we might see with someone who's got dementia and is 78, 88, 98 years old.
Sure.
So again, I don't know that I would say the number of osteoblasts really change depending on our lifestyle choices. The quality of our bone may change, but I would say we still have essentially the same capacity for those numbers of cells than seeing them depreciate. Yeah.
So for the osteocytes, do they have like a function of the
Yeah, osteocytes are essentially, I don't know, I guess you would think of them like our parents and stuff like that. They're like taking care of business, like day-to-day stuff. They actually extend out and they communicate with all the other osteocytes. They've got their nice little sewing circle. They all talk about what's happening in bone. So essentially, the osteocytes are responsible for regulating and managing the bone itself, specifically like the metabolism of bone. So the osteocytes do serve a function as they grow older. Now the osteoclasts, these guys are really big. They're catabolic in nature. They're made from the fusion of many monocytes, so it's a multi-nucleated cell. We find these concentrated in the endosteum. And that doesn't mean they're exclusively in the endosteum. Does that make sense? So they're concentrated in the endosteum, but they're not exclusively there. These release really powerful lysosomes that are able to break down the bone itself. And this allows for the resorption of the bone matrix into the bloodstream. And we see these being really active in things like development, growth, and we also see them being very active in maintenance and repair. So maintenance could be, I'm a kung fu karate master, and so I'm pounding a piece of concrete every day, or a piece of steel every day. My bone is going to get damaged by me doing that, right? Those osteoclasts are going to go in there and get rid of the bad or the broken bone cells, and then the osteoblasts are going to begin to build bone to help protect me. And if you've ever seen someone who's done that, what do their knuckles look like? Fat. They're really big and they're really lumpy. Okay, it looks crazy, right? It's almost like they have like horns growing out of their knuckles. Yes, sir?
Can you please explain the resorption of bone matrix?
Resorption essentially means it's being resorbed into the bloodstream. So essentially that bone is being broken down, but we're not just going to leave it free floating. Instead, it'll get resorbed into the actual circulation or the bloodstream itself, so that maybe if there's not enough calcium in our heart, maybe if there's not enough calcium in the nervous tissue, it'll transport that calcium to those areas so that they can do their functions. Because we need calcium in order for the heart to contract. We need calcium in order for our neurotransmitters to be released. We need it for our gut motility and mobility. We need it for our muscles to relax. So calcium is a very essential nutrient, which is why it's a great thing to be stored in such large amounts. But when it says resorption, that word really just means it's being restored back into the bloodstream. Does that make sense? So whether it's maintenance and repair, like from a fracture or it's intentional structural damage itself, osteoclasts are going to go in and help get rid of the debris. Now, of course, the skeletal system itself begins to develop in utero through an embryological period. It begins as sort of this connective tissue matrix. It's mostly this collagen-type mold or model that develops from the mold, from the cartilage itself. That tissue begins to form bone, sort of around the model. So it's almost like you make a 3D printed model out of plastic, and then you go back and you replace the plastic model with actual bony structures. We're going to see that both the spongy and the compact bone are formed either via intramembranous ossification, okay, or endochondral ossification. Typically, endochondral ossification is reserved for things like our long bones, like our fibula, tibia, but also the metacarpals. Remember, the long bones themselves aren't named that way just because they're super duper long. It's how they're developed. And so endochondral ossification is what we see in all our long bones. Intramembranous ossification, these are our regular bones like our vertebrae, but also things like our cranial bones and also our flat bones. Those also develop via intramembranous ossification. Now there's two types of growth. There's growth in length, which we call interstitial growth, and then there's growth in width, and that's the appositional growth. The way I remember the appositional growth is I think of a big fat apple. And so that reminds me that it's growing in diameter. So it's getting thicker or getting bigger. The prefix inter means between two things. So the growth is happening between two things and it's getting longer and longer. And that's how I remember the interstitial growth. But of course, if you remember one, the other one's got to be the opposite, right? If you remember one, you know the other one. At least you should. Again, the osteocytes, those are the mature bone cells. They're responsible for taking care of the day-to-day stuff that's happening inside a bone. And we don't often think of our bones as having a metabolism, but they do. The bone or the skeletal system itself is a living, dynamic system. I never thought about that as I was coming through the program. It wasn't until I was teaching this class for a couple of years and I started thinking about it. I was like, wow, this is really like a living, dynamic system. It grows, it degrades in response to stress or lack of stress. And it's kind of interesting to consider that bone becomes thicker and stronger as it encounters stress, right? If there's no stress to that skeletal system, it doesn't grow and it doesn't become stronger. And then I think about that as an analogy for our personal lives. How if we're not encountering some level of stress, we don't really grow, right? We just stay stagnant. We stay where we're at. It's the exact same thing. Our bone sort of reflects how we personally grow as well too. We need a little bit of stress to push us and get us outside of our comfort zone. So again, the osteocytes are the maturation of the osteoblasts, which came through these osteoprogenitor cells. So initially, these guys start off here, become this, build themselves into a ditch, if you want to think of it that way, and then they mature and become osteocytes.
Real quick, osteogenic cells, you know they're on specialized stem cells at first. Can they become anything else
At
or
that
only?
point, yeah, so when they're initially those stem cells, it's almost like when we were young and we wanted to decide what we were going to do for our future.
Mhm.
And then you pursued that, and then in your 20s, maybe you changed your mind, so you did something else. In your 30s, you did something else.
Yeah.
They're more like somebody who decided what they were going to do, and now they're like 70. It's like they don't have time maybe to rechange. The 70s maybe not fair, maybe like in your 90s. We've had people who were like in their 70s, believe it or not, who actually came through the program. So you can still. But you know, it's like you're like on your deathbed, you can't change, you can't become
Gotcha,
advanced.
yeah.
But initially, yeah, you can still become any other cell. You become a toe cell, they
Okay.
become like a tooth cell.
Yeah.
Yeah, those cells themselves are really interesting because those undifferentiated stem cells can become anything. That's why sometimes you can actually find like a tooth embedded in bone somewhere. It's really weird. It's like that cell somehow got misinformation, became a tooth that's in the middle of like your temporal bone. I love this picture. It's always makes me think like the baby's like partying it up in there. Looks like it's like pounding a beer or something like that. I prefer to think it's like a microphone, like, you know, really getting into some sort of metal or something like that, I guess. I guess it could be Celine Dion. I don't know. But he looks really happy, right? Yeah, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl, but it looks really happy. I like that. Now, ossification or osteogenesis, we're going to see there's two kinds of connective tissue that we see in the embryonic skeleton. That first kind is the fibrous connective tissue, and then there's pieces of hyaline cartilage. And we said hyaline cartilage was what kind of cartilage? Hyaline cartilage is also articular cartilage. That's right. Good job. Hyaline cartilage is also articular cartilage. Now, this typically begins at week 7. That's kind of what we would answer on a test. You have to remember, kids tend to do things at their own pace, so maybe week 8, could be week 6, and you can see that process begin. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong. It just means that maybe that cycle is a little bit different. Or maybe the baby's actually 7 weeks and they're mating at 6 weeks because of the size. We said compact bone is nice and compact. Everything's like nice and tight. There's no room in between. Spongy bone is nice and open. There's space in between the cells. The compact bone is supplied by something known as the osteon system, and we're going to see that in just a second. Spongy bone is supplied through something called the trabecular system, but the fundamental components are exactly the same. So the cellular composition is exactly the same. The only real difference is the organization of those cells. And so with the compact bone, it's called the osteon system. Spongy bone is the trabecular system. Now, when we look at the compact bone, this is just a histological slice, a small cell slice. We can see these little circles. These little circles. That remind you guys of anything?
A tree.
A tree, right? It kind of looks a little bit like a tree, right? Only there's multiple circles, like there's multiple trees in there. So again, each one of these circles that you see together collectively is an osteon. An osteon is made of a number of things, okay? We typically find that osteon system obviously in the cortical bone, but we find it typically on the outside of a bone in areas that need a lot of protection and support. So they're very resistant to stress from weight. And it's ironic to think like the bones of our spinal column are mostly spongy bone. And spongy bone is not really designed to carry weight, but we think that our spine is really supporting and carrying all of our weight. But if our spongy bone actually had to absorb all the actual real weight of our body, those bones would just all collapse. It's really all the soft tissue structures that surround it that give it the support and stability that it has. Okay, because it's really only compact bone that's really able to withstand those big forces. So you'll find a lot of compact bone in places like your femur. You'll find a lot of compact bone in areas with a lot of stress on them, like our sacrum and our ilium. Now the osteon system itself has this conversion system, and we're going to see that that's how these blood vessels pass through. Another word for the haversian system or that haversian canal is the central canal. Each one of these osteons need a blood supply. So the central portion right through here, there's actually an artery that passes through there, and it's right in the middle, so we call that the central canal or the haversian canal. So again, the haversian canal is what runs longitudinally up and down through bone, through each one of those osteons. There's also blood vessels that run across bone as well too, transversely, running across. We call those the perforating canals or Volkmann's canals. You need to be familiar with both Volkmann's and the haversian canals. Okay? So Volkmann's and the haversian canals are both AKAs for the central and the perforating canals. You need to be familiar with both of those because they both can show up on your test. The lamellae just means layer. Okay? So each one of these layers right through here, you see here's a layer, an outer layer, there's another inner layer. You see how there's another inner layer right through there? Each one of those layers are known as a lamella. When we find them like this, we call them the concentric lamellae. The concentric lamellae are the specific names we give to the osteon system that create the layers that are surrounding each osteon itself. So the concentric are rings of calcified tissue, and they all form around that one individual central canal. Right? So you see right here the central canal? There's a central canal. Inside there is a central artery. Okay. What was the other name for that central canal?
Haversian.
The haversian canal. That's right. And now do you see that we have the lamellae? You see this ring right through there? Then there's another ring right through there. And there's another ring right through there. And then it stops. So all of this collectively is one osteon. The osteon is made of many layers that all surround the central canal. Does that make sense? Now again, there's multiple osteons that make up the actual bone itself. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, so like you kind of compared it to like a tree trunk.
Uh-huh.
Is it formed kind of similarly? Like it starts right at the beginning and then.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it like that, 'cause it all begins around this blood vessel. So you need a nutrient supply,
Yeah.
almost like you need water right into the tree. It's the same thing here, and that water is going to carry the nutrients that the blood vessel actually needs, or excuse me, that the bone needs in order to create the bone. And then it all begins to grow around it, and then it grows another layer around it, and then it grows another layer around it until it stops. Now, concentric lamellae are nice circles. But there's also this space in between the concentric lamellae that needs to be filled in as well too. It's almost like there's two bricks, but they don't quite go all the way together, so you got to fill it in with some cement or something like that. If we look right through there, you see this like sort of irregular shape, bony matrix? That's called interstitial lamellae. So the interstitial lamellae is a layer of bony tissue that we'll find in any gaps or any space between the osteons. Does that make sense? So it's a little bit like you got an osteon here and an osteon here, but there's this gap in between the two, and you just kind of put the filler bone in between it, and that's called the interstitial lamellae. So it's not a traditional layer like we would think about it, but it's still there.
Can you point to what you were saying?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. See that right there? That's that interstitial lamellae. Here's some interstitial lamellae right through there. There's another piece of it. There's another piece. So if it doesn't look like a nice circle, the circumferential, excuse me, the concentric lamellae, then that's the interstitial lamellae. Now, do you notice that there's also this ring around the entire outside of bone? You see that? That's the circumferential lamellae. So it's going around the entire circumference of the bone itself. So concentric lamellae are the rings that we find in the osteon itself. Circumferential lamellae is what's covering the entire bone. Okay? So the outermost portion is that circumferential lamellae. So again, the surface of bone, it's got an outer portion, an inner portion. Okay? Now in the osteon, there's these little sort of lakes, if you want to think of them that way, called lacuna. Okay? Every time I say lacuna, I think matata. Yeah, right here, lacuna, matata. You see all these little spaces right through here? Each one of those are little depressions in the bone known as the lacuna. Now, in the lacuna is where we find the mature osteocyte.
Even my
So
bones
the
are depressed.
lacuna, as a cell went from being an osteoblast to an osteocyte, they mature just like they're out on the beach, like soaking up the sun. okay? And enjoying life, right? So in the lacuna, which is a little depression in the osteon itself, we'll find the osteocytes. And the osteocytes do what for bone? They regulate the daily metabolism, essentially metabolism. We can think function with metabolism is the word we'd be looking for on the test. So again, the lacuna are these small little spaces, they're like little lakes, where we find the osteocytes, which are mature osteoblasts. The caniculi, or the can I lick your eye? Okay,
What?
can I lick your eye? That's how it's described to me, and I love it. But they're just called the caniculi. The caniculi are these little extensions through the osteons themselves that allow the osteocytes to extend through and communicate with the other cells. So again, it's like a little lake that has like little small rivers that are connecting into it. The osteocyte will reach through there and connect to the other cells so that it can communicate. And every cell knows what's happening in the other places. So, bless you. So again, the caniculi are the connections between the lamellae. They're these little canals where we can allow the communication of the osteocytes via these little gap junctions in between the two cells. Let's see, I gotta get a picture of the caniculi. All right, here. See this right through here? You see how this has got this small little canal between the cell and the cell? That's a caniculi. So the caniculi is a small tunnel where the osteocyte extends through so it can communicate with the other bone, or the other parts of the bone. Yeah.
For the interstitial lamellae, where is that getting its nutrients?
Same thing. So the osteoblasts are still building that bone. They're just not building it in that regular concentric circle that we would normally look at, but it's still the osteoblast that's doing it. As it builds itself in between the two osteons, it then matures into the osteocyte, and it still has caniculi. So it still fundamentally has the other things that the other structures have, but it's just not in a nice circle. Now, spongy bone, we said earlier, it's a little bit like SpongeBob. It's nice, it's open space in between the tissue that's inside of those. There's no osteon system. Instead, it's the trabecular system that we see in there. But again, it's made up of the same stuff. We're going to see that in just a second. So again, there's some advantages to spongy bone. It provides a little bit of space and protection for what we have as our red and our yellow marrow. Inside the spongy bone is the only place we find for the formation of new blood cells for hematopoiesis. And we said the difference between erythropoiesis and hematopoiesis was what? Erythropoiesis was specifically red blood cells. Hematopoiesis was all blood cells, right? So it could be platelets, it could be white blood cells, it could be like that, any of those. The only place we see this happening is in the ribs, sternum, vertebral bodies, proximal epiphysis of the femur, humerus, and the ala of the ilium. So that lets you know all of those areas are filled with spongy bone. Now, spongy bone itself also allows for the bone to be a lot lighter. So again, if our bone was filled in with nothing but compact bone, that bone would be really, really, really heavy. Okay, I think about like the Marvel comics with X-Men. Wolverine's got like adamantium all in his skeleton, so he sits down on the motorcycle and it almost like collapses under because he's just so heavy. That's the way our skeletal system would be. It would be super, super heavy if it were all compact and things like that. But the balance between the compact bone and the spongy bone, that's what allows for the lighter weight and the easier mobility. So it's easier for us to move, but it still provides some protection, right? So it provides some protection with less weight. A lot of the bones in our skull are like that. We have lots of spongy bone inside of our skull, and it allows our skull to be a little bit lighter while still also providing support and protection for our brain.
So, I know there was a video that I saw of like these monks who will headbutt things.
Yeah, your frontal bone is actually really, really hard.
So is that also going to be a spongy bone?
And that is a spongy bone, yeah,
So
believe it or not, but your frontal bone is a really, really tough bone.
So you could still build up and further ossify.
That's true. Yeah, but what you would see is you would see sort of like lumps begin to form on the outside of the bone. So it'd be a little bit like the karate master guy who's like pounding his fist and his knuckles become like really big.
Right.
It would be the same thing there. If they were to continue doing that over and over again, then you would see the buildup of bone. But you can learn how to transfer your force through a structure without necessarily doing that as well too.
I see.
So if you learn how to move with the appropriate speed at a certain velocities, like if you go fast enough, you can actually transfer that force when you make contact. And it's almost like you're releasing. It's almost like a Dragon Ball Z type thing. You like throw the throw the charge.
No, for
You
sure.
can take your force, you can actually disperse it through a structure, and you can actually learn how to do that without necessarily hurting yourself. I would say initially it's gonna hurt you,
Sure.
but once you figure out how to do it, you stop doing that, so you may not see the same degradation of the tissue. Yeah. I know when I first started karate and I would break boards and stuff like that, it was really hard and hurt really bad. And then it got to a point where I could take really big boards and just hold it and I could still just pop it and it would just break and my knuckles stopped getting red. They didn't even hurt anymore. So it was once you learn how to do it, it changed it. So I'm not sure if that's what's happening there. And so they may not have big giant lumps on their
I
head.
don't see that, yeah.
But that theoretically would be what would happen if their body was absorbing more of the impact and becoming damaged.
We should do a small lesson during.
We should do it
office
definitely, we
hours.
should do a lesson, we should do like that. We'll say it, I'll see at the school, like buy some boards and stuff like that, we all come in here and learn how to break boards and stuff.
I think so,
We'll be like, oh no, this is a lab experiment. Here we can see that spongy bone. It's nice and open, we said the spongy bone has what kind of system in it? It's not the osteon, it's the trabecular system. But again, when we look at the when we look at the trabeculae, microscopically, it still looks like an osteon, right? It still has what we see as these concentric lamellae. It still has these lacuna. It still has these openings called the caniculi. And it still has a canal. So again, when we look at the trabecular system under a microscope, it actually still kind of looks like an osteon, but the difference is that it's kind of woven out like a big sponge. And that's why we see it called spongy bone. Now, we find that spongy bone inside these cranial bones, and typically when we find it in the cranial bones, we call it the diploid. So D-I-P-L-O-E. So typically that's what we call it when we find it specifically in the skull. I feel like I have that written. So again, diploid, it's D-I-P-L-O-E, like two dots over the E. Okay? That's specifically the name we call spongy bone when we find it in the skull, and specifically in those flat bones. Okay? So again, that's typically what we call it. Now, this flat bone doesn't have diaphysis, there's no epiphysis, and bone marrow actually fills in the spaces with the where we see the trabecula. So again, here we can see it, that diploid, or that spongy bone. Again, the trabecular system is almost identical to what we can see with the osteoid system. But macroscopically, when you look at it, it just looks very different. Now, bone itself has a lot of blood supply, and that makes sense, right? If bone is a dynamic living system, it needs a rich blood supply because it's going to be requiring those minerals to create bone. Where if bone is broken down, it needs a way to get those materials out to the actual blood cell. So again, there's a very rich blood supply where we have these periosteal arteries that are supplying the outside of the bone, but then there's these nutrient arteries that pass inside bone as well too, and then passes through those canals. Now, we can see in there that there's this word anastomose. Can we talk about what the word anastomose means? It's like you have one artery here, you have another artery here, and then they connect together and become one artery. So anastomose is like a running together of structures. And so we frequently will see that, where we see like one artery wraps around the anterior part of my humerus. There's another one that wraps around the back. They both circle my arm until they ultimately connect around the humerus itself. Okay? So they anastomose. Anastomose is what it is. A lot of lymph and nerve supply that's passing through these bones as well too. Specifically, the periosteum is very rich in those sensory nerves. Typically, whenever there's some sort of a fracture, whether it's a stress fracture or an actual fracture itself, that tearing and that pain that we feel comes from the actual periosteum. So it really is the periosteum being torn that actually causes the most pain from breaking bone. Anybody in here breaking bone? It's pretty horrific, right? That first night's really bad. You just stay up all night crying if you don't have painkillers, or if you don't know well enough to take the painkillers. And then even if you take the painkiller, you still feel it. It's still really painful. Here we can see just all the blood supply that's coming into the bone itself. So one of the reasons why when we experience a fracture, there's so much swelling and there's so much engorging blood is because all of these blood vessels are passing through there. If something happens to destroy or disrupt that blood supply, it's going to cause a tremendous amount of swelling from the damage of the tissue. Is that a good thing? It's a good thing, bad thing. It's bad because it hurts so bad, but if something doesn't hurt you, what will you keep doing? You keep on making it worse. So if when I fractured my leg, if I could just keep walking on it without any pain, I would just keep walking on it, right? And how many of us ignore an injury? Anybody here ignore an injury? I know I have. Like I've torn stuff before, I've broken stuff before, and then I just kept on competing or did whatever I needed to do. Okay, so we're really bad about ignoring things that don't cause us tremendous pain, and even then, sometimes if it does, we still won't stop. So we almost have to be immobilized in order for that to happen. Bone is like that normally, depending on where you fracture. You could fracture one of your spinal bones, and you can still keep going because of all of the tissue. You remember earlier, I was telling you most of our spinal bones are made of what kind of bone? Spongy. Is it compact or is it spongy? So since it's mostly spongy bone, that tells us it's not really very severely weight bearing. Does that make sense? So if it's not carrying a lot of weight, you can actually fracture one of those bones, and all the muscles and other tissues will allow you to continue moving. So people will experience things like a compact fracture of their spinal bone, and they'll tell you like, yeah, man, I've had this terrible pain in my back. It was there for about 6 weeks, and then it just went away. It feels better now. I think I'm okay. You take the x-ray, you look at it, they've actually experienced a pretty severe fracture in their spine. And they don't even understand because they were able to keep working. The reason is because that bone is not under the same sort of stress as something like one of our long bones. If you fracture your femur or your tibia or your humerus, you're out. Does that make sense? So again, that's why you can experience the fracture so much, but it doesn't make as big of an impact on those bones. But there's a very rich blood supply supplying all these guys as it happens to them. Here we can see just the trabecular system itself. We can see the different cells. You just saw that a minute ago. Nothing new to see there. What we're going to do is we're going to take a short break. At 8 o'clock, I want you guys back in here. I'm going to open that